Hello. So, welcome to Mediate. I'm Alex Griffin, and today I'm joined by bestselling author and investigative journalist Vicky Ward. Vicky, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
So, if you've clicked on this, you know that we're here to talk about Jared Kushner. And Vicky has spent years covering Jared Kushner, the real estate scion who married Ivanka Trump, as we all know, which led to him having a senior advisor role in the White House for 4 years. And in 2019, Vicky published the best-selling book Kushner Inc., which was a deep dive into the Trump administration, as well as Jared and Ivanka's role in those 4 wild years. So I was kind of hoping that we could kind of just begin there. Like, what
Mhm.
brought you to the book? And if we could just kind of lay the background before we get into kind
Sure.
of what we're really here to talk about, which is the
Yeah,
foreign
yeah.
investment. But just if we could talk about the book and what Kushner Inc. really means.
Sure. Alex, actually, because it's an interesting question with an important answer. I think, given you know, what may happen if Trump wins the election in November. So I came to Kushner Inc. Because I'd written two books prior to that. My first book was about Lehman Brothers, which Trump loved. Told my children that your mother is the best writer in the world, and they were somewhat flummoxed by that. And at the time they were reading Harry Potter, they said, "Mr. Trump, what about J.K. Rowling?" I'm not sure he knew who that was. But my second book was about the world of New York real estate. It was called The Liar's Ball, and it told the history of the General Motors building in New York, because that at the time was the most valuable piece of commercial real estate in America. And Donald Trump, his history with that building didn't end up being a good one. He had first dibs on it, and he ended up not being able to purchase it when it came on the market. And there was no way to whitewash that. It's just a fact. And had he bought it, he would have made billions of dollars. So he was extremely annoyed by this book and tweeted very helpfully for marketing purposes, "Just finished, really boring book by third-rate author." But because of that, I had a background. I knew the world of New York real estate. And I was also very familiar with the Kushner's real estate business. And in 2016, I wrote a story for for Esquire magazine about the Kushner brothers. And I was very struck, and this was while the Trump campaign, run by Jared and Steve Bannon at the time, was gearing up for Trump's first election race. I was really struck when writing that piece for Esquire at sort of how Jared Kushner had changed. And I had known him when he first moved to New York, when his father was put in jail. I had actually met him, and I had some years, back then, I had quite a soft spot for him. He was a kind of vulnerable, soft-spoken, intelligent guy, and I had a lot of time for him. But what was super interesting was sort of over 10 years later, he had morphed into someone that, according to my reporting, was very vengeful, very petty, didn't think the rules applied to him, and he wasn't that interested in the details of his own real estate business. He didn't know his numbers. He was very interested in having lunch with Rupert Murdoch and sort of various people, power brokers, but he was less interested in the nitty-gritty of his business. So because I had been focused on the world of New York real estate and on Jared and the Kushner's business, I was paying close attention, possibly unlike anybody else, to the fact that the Kushners had this real problem when Jared went into the Trump White House. The Kushners were sitting on a ticking time bomb, where they had this trophy building, 666 Fifth Avenue, and they had a massive $1.4 billion loan that was coming due. American buyers and investors had long ago said, this is a piece of dirt, this is garbage, nobody would touch it, which meant they were entirely dependent on foreign investment. And so it seemed to be a no-brainer that we should be looking very closely at what Jared Kushner was doing in terms of his dealings with foreign countries, particularly rich foreign countries, and to look at what was going on, how the Kushners were going to solve this problem. And so right from the get-go, as the time ticked on and you saw the headlines appear about Jared Kushner suddenly being, quote unquote, secretary of everything, and you saw the headlines about him meeting with the Russian ambassador, taking a meeting during the transition with a Chinese possible investor who subsequently went to jail. You saw the headlines about the White House logs being closed. You saw the headlines about how Jared hadn't managed to divest properly from his own businesses. You saw the headlines that he wasn't cleared for a top security clearance. And I was going, oh my God. And then obviously, in the nick of time, the 666 Fifth Avenue was bailed out in an extraordinary way by a 99-year loan, a lease rather, with a 99-year lease with all the money paid up front. I mean, you don't have to be in real estate to see that doesn't make much sense. And the company that did it was a Canadian company called Brookfield, whose largest outside shareholder is the Gulf state of Qatar. And if you looked at what was happening at our foreign policy at that time, was Jared had managed to get rid of the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. He'd been fired by Trump. And what had happened, sort of completely behind Rex Tillerson's back anyway, was that the Saudis and the Emiratis and a couple of other Gulf states had blockaded Qatar. Qatar is very rich. It shares a gas field with Iran. But Qatar is also where the US has its airbase in the region. And the Saudis and the Emiratis had wound up blockading Qatar, to the astonishment of Rex Tillerson and the Secretary of Defense at the time, James Mattis. And they realized the person who'd encouraged the Saudis to do this and the Emiratis was Jared, because they would never have done it without thinking they had American support. Trump was kind of mystified, apparently. He wasn't even aware that the US had an airbase there. So this was all sort of Jared's doing. But as time ticked by, Trump's relationship with the Saudis, not Jared's, Trump's relationship with the Saudis changed a bit, because the Saudis wanted him to invest in the war in Yemen, and Trump said no. The Qataris saw an opening, and they came to the White House. And within a sort of 6-week period, two things happened. One was that the 666 Fifth Avenue buildings financial problems were suddenly solved for the Kushners with this company, Brookfield. And the US withdrew its support for the blockade of Qatar. This is the problem with the way the media operates a little bit. I mean, look, there are amazing beat reporters covering the White House. There were then, there are now, in Washington, but they weren't covering the Trumps or Jared and Ivanka, particularly, who I would argue the real appearance of grift that went on in that White House was led by those two. They weren't looking at their at their businesses. They weren't covering the White House as a kleptocracy focused on them. And I think I was lucky because I had this background where I knew a lot about New York real estate. I had lots of sources, and that's what I sort of got impatient. I kept waiting for the Washington Post or the New York Times or somebody to write about this, and they didn't. So that's why I wrote Kushner Inc.
I spent the Trump years on a news desk in Tel Aviv, and I
Wow.
remember very well, the Qatari blockade, and of course the sale of 666. And we looked at your writing quite a bit to try to understand kind of where this web all connected, and it's so complicated, and
Right.
there really would need to be, individual point people at large publications to kind of unravel it.
Right.
So in the years after the book, you followed the story and you published a three-part series on your Substack, Vicky Ward Investigates. And since then, after Kushner left the White House, he raised over $3 billion from these foreign governments, the Saudis and the Qataris included. So I think kind of like just to give a brief overview of where the conversation's going. So what I wanted to know and talk to you about is, what were those billions for? Like, what is he now doing managing this money? And what should voters know about Jared Kushner's business deals, before the election? And is this really something that should be an electoral issue for the public? So you wrote in that series in 2022 that the $2 billion the Saudis invested in Kushner's private equity firm, and this is a quote, was an IOU for a
Mm.
synthetic foreign policy led by Kushner during the Trump years, and also a bet by MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, on a return to the White House by Kushner's father-in-law, Donald Trump. So just kind of, if you could help us unpack, what was the relationship between
Yeah.
Kushner?
And obviously, this isn't just my opinion,
Right.
Alex. I mean, this is based on reporting from many of the sources, both in our intelligence agencies and around those countries that were very helpful to me in the reporting of Kushner Inc. So, sort of to break that down, the the Congress were late, but at least they were late to the party, but they finally arrived. They did, once the once the Saudis who kicked this off, invested in Jared Kushner's new fund, investing $2 billion over the advice of their top advisors, who made the very reasonable point that Jared Kushner doesn't have any experience
Yeah.
in private equity. His experience as a businessman is in real estate.
Right. Which
MBS, right?
wasn't the best experience as it was. It wasn't a wildly
Right.
successful developer.
Correct. So when MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, overruled his financial advisors and invested this, it was initially $2 billion. Now, five other countries have come in, including the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Taiwanese. And it's now $3 billion. But once the initial money was there, Congress began to investigate, because clearly this was an appearance of a quid pro quo. Now, Kushner has always completely denied that. But at some point, Congress also unearthed emails to Jared's father, Charles, around about 666 Fifth Avenue, emails between the Qataris and Charles Kushner around the time that the Saudi sort of the foreign policy around Qatar that I just talked to you about was unfolding on Jared's watch. But without a smoking gun, without an email that says specifically, if you do this deal, there'll be a quid pro quo. It's really hard to get beyond this idea that there's just an appearance of self-serving, of grift. But your question though was really about what did Jared do for the Saudis to get this money?
There was that famous, I think it was a State Department cable that was intercepted where MBS said, Kushner was in his pocket. There's been all of these many stories over the years about their close relationship, like texting late at night.
Yeah. So what I reported after Kushner Inc. That wasn't known then, that is known now, is that MBS, it's thought by, not just by me, but by people like Bruce Riedel, John Brennan, serious people with a lot of US security expertise. So people forget Mohammed bin Salman was not the crown prince of Saudi Arabia when Trump became president in 2017. The crown prince was a guy called Mohammed bin Nayef, who was considered a hero by the US intelligence agencies. He had been incredibly helpful in warning us when terrorists were getting on planes and things like that after 9/11. And he was considered such a valuable ally of the United States that, in fact, in the early months of the Trump White House, Mike Pompeo, who was then CIA director, gave him, Mohammed bin Nayef, a medal, the George Tenet Medal. He was really considered a great ally and a great hero. But he reckoned without Jared Kushner. MBS made a very early and unusual visit to Washington. And given that MBS wasn't even the crown prince, was very strange. He and Jared Kushner, they're roughly the same age, met and began a relationship, formed a friendship, and Mohammed bin Nayef, and we've seen this because I've seen text messages that are now parts of litigation. So, this is not opinion, it's based on reporting. Mohammed bin Nayef realized that he needed to sort of get in front of Trump. He was planning, he wanted to take over from the king, but in legit, who's very old, but legitimately, and needed the back of America. And all the reporting suggests, and he even hired a Washington lobbyist to help him do this, who was close to Trump, a guy called Robert Strick. But the reporting suggests that Jared obviously got wind of this and warned MBS. And very quickly, Mohammed bin Nayef was sort of thrown in jail. And the guy who was helping him wound up fleeing to Canada, where he's lived in exile, and again, court papers show that that Mohammed bin Salman, he's locked up his children, and he wants him to return to the country, and for obvious reasons, he's not planning to do that. So but my point is, Mohammed bin Salman owes Jared for helping him become crown prince before you even get to any of the other issues on the table. So that's something that I think people really don't realize.
I feel like that's very under discussed. I remember
really under discussed.
Yeah, I remember the palace
and Jared helped him become crown prince against the advice of the American intelligence agencies, who wanted the other guy, who thought the other guy would behave in America's interests. Okay, so that is a big deal. And then the second point, which is more discussed in Kushner Inc. and is more widely known, is that that they were sort of caught having WhatsApp exchanges, and one big reason that Jared was denied a security clearance, and that when the blockade of Qatar failed, in that one of the big reasons that the Saudis and the Emiratis did it is Qatar is very, very rich. But when no money was coming, MBS needed another way to get money, which is when he locked all his relatives up
in those 5-star hotels.
Ritz-Carlton. Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
And it was sort of, again, widely reported at the time that Jared Kushner was very helpful to him he's denied this, but in providing US intelligence around that. But the reason MBS locked his relatives up in the Ritz-Carlton was to basically to be able to control all their money. So there is that. There's also, we did an arms deal with Saudi Arabia before, and let's not forget that Jared persuaded his father-in-law, the president, to make the US's first state visit of the Trump administration, not to a country with shared democratic values, but to Saudi Arabia. And it was so egregious because the point of that trip was, supposedly the theme of it was cooperation in the Gulf. Which is why it's so ironic, for want of a better word, that a few weeks later, while Rex Tillerson and James Mattis were minding their own business at a conference in Australia, they woke up to read that the Saudis and the Emiratis were blockading Qatar, when we just led an entire state visit that was supposed to be about all these countries getting on. Anyway, so
when you fast forward, it all kind of then culminates, obviously, in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Right, and then again, how helpful was Jared to Mohammed bin Salman about that? If anybody tried to lead the whitewashing of that in this country, it was Jared Kushner.
Exactly. So I think kind of, moving forward a bit into the election, we're 2 weeks out now until we will decide who our next president is. What do you think are the political implications of this for Trump come November? Is this something people should be talking about more, or is it just kind of...
Yeah, it's
Is it old
really
news?
Frustrating to me that yet again, I feel like we're in Groundhog Day here. Because what happens is that Trump, who operates in plain sight, for better or worse, whatever you think of him, Trump is who he is. But he's so larger than life that he takes up all the focus. And even when he was president, I would argue that what Jared, and Ivanka to a lesser degree, but what Jared was doing in terms of self-service as opposed to public service was in plain sight, and people did not pay attention in the way that they should have, because everybody was so focused on Trump and his unpredictability and what he was going to do minute to minute. And now there is the same focus on Trump, the same sort of breathless, oh my God, can you believe he's done this? When actually, and I understand, people talk about the risk of dictatorship. Just look at Jared and what Jared is doing. There is a massive risk of kleptocracy, blatant kleptocracy. Jared Kushner is right now, and Ivanka are investing in properties in the Balkans. The Balkans are Putin's front yard. We have no idea who the bulk of the money coming into these projects is. It's dark money. The likelihood that Putin is in there, I would argue, is enormous. And so far, the only reporting around this has been very benign. And Jared gives lots of quotes about, well, I run sort of the, gold standard of businesses. But really, whether he goes into a Trump administration, which he may, never say never with these guys. He clearly wants a sort of senior statesman role, but he may not need to join a Trump administration to have that. I mean, which is even worse. He can run a kitchen cabinet from Miami. And so I would argue that we should 100% be focused on Jared's business interests, because what it means is these are all the people who've invested with Jared. These are Trump's IOUs before he even begins. And it's really, really important. And sure, in all the other things, domestic issues that he talks about, but this is, these are creating vulnerabilities for him before he even begins, and we're not talking about them.
Yeah. So absolutely, the Senate Democrats have opened an investigation.
Yeah.
Ron Wyden, who's from Oregon, the chair of the Finance Committee, he put out a press release in which he kind of laid out some of the allegations that they're investigating. And he wrote that Kushner's Affinity Partners, which is the private equity firm, which now sits atop the $3 billion, he called it a workaround for foreign governments to pay Trump officials without disclosure.
Yeah.
What do you make of the Wyden investigation? Do you think he's asking the right questions?
I think he is asking the right questions, but I think particularly, but I think it's very difficult. There are two problems in getting anywhere. And you would need, and especially if Jared Kushner doesn't go into the White House. Were he to go into the White House, there are very clear laws prohibiting from doing business for himself with foreign countries while he's. But even then, as we've seen in the investigations of 666 Fifth Avenue, you need a smoking gun. There is a massive stench around this. But no email that's says this specific quid pro quo. So I think Ron Wyden is on a fishing expedition, but I'm not sure he's going to. Unfortunately, I'm not sure he's going to be able to hook anything. I think he's absolutely asking the right questions. But the other problem that you have is that there's going to be, or that there is currently limited interest in Congress to go after this, and that is because of Hunter Biden, which is very unfortunate, because really, you're comparing apples to oranges, but that does impede. I think it dampens the Democrats' interest from really going full bore after this in the way that I think they should.
I think it would also seem, the Democrats seem very likely to lose the Senate, which is also what happened to the Democrats' initial investigation in the House into Kushner. They lost the gavel, and therefore the investigations just
exactly
move. And James Comer led his investigation against Hunter Biden. You have done quite a bit of investigative reporting into Hunter Biden.
Yeah,
I know, as you said, it is not exactly a very clear comparison. But do you think surrounding, at least let's say, the congressional investigation into Hunter versus Kushner, has there been a double standard in the media for the amount of attention that they've been paid each investigation?
Well, I've been, if you've read, Alex, my Substack, I actually think there was a double standard. It was wrong. I think I wanted to pursue Hunter Biden actually much more aggressively back when I was at CNN, and I wish I had. There wasn't the appetite for it, and that I found that very frustrating at that time. Um, I
What
think
what do you attribute that to? Do you think?
I attribute it to the fact that Hunter Biden, unfortunately, seems to be one of these presidential relatives in the mold of Tony Rodham or Billy Carter. You know, slightly sad. Uh, sad people who are not affecting foreign policy in real time. I mean, having said that, there was a bad meeting that Joe Biden, when he was vice president, showed up to at Cafe Milano with Hunter that he should not have gone to, in my estimation. But the but I think that the double standard is that Hunter Biden is clearly so troubled as a human being and is geographically the other side of the country from the White House, and that is possibly why the media gave him a more of a pass. But I wish they hadn't. I think that was wrong. Actually, I really do.
So I think, kind of again, just looking forward, um, when you researched Kushner, you spoke extensively to White House insiders, to people who were in that orbit. Do you think, as we kind of are pondering a second Trump administration, are there figures around Trump now who are kind of akin to Kushner? Are there, how do you think the administration will be staffed? Is there any red flags of who might have, kind of similar needs, maybe to try to make money off of the office, off of their position?
Well, sure. I mean, don't think for a second that Jared and Ivanka won't find. I mean, they'll get so rich that, I mean, be unimaginable wealth, and they don't even need to be in the government. But I wouldn't underestimate just because they don't go in. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, and by the way, they may. I wouldn't. Nothing with these two should be off the table. I mean, we've learned. Last in 2016, they said they weren't going in, and yet they did. So, um, but but the people who are loyal to Trump, are often the same people who've been loyal to Jared and Ivanka. Rick Grinnell is in the middle of these Balkans deals for Jared, and he is said to be very high up on the candidate for Secretary of State. And he's the person who put Jared and Ivanka's new business deal together. So, I mean, yes. And Jared has been openly saying that, he is advising the Trump campaign from afar, and that he's taking people's calls from around the world. So again, this is where I talked about kleptocracy. It's sort of like 1-800-Jared. If you're a foreign leader who's got some cash you want to invest in the new Trump administration, phone Jared.
I mean, so I think the accusation around Kushner that, just as you kind of laid out, where there is no maybe direct evidence linking these quid pro quos that we can absolutely point to, but the idea that he has been kind of selling foreign policy favors is such a kind of easy concept to digest. Why just is this a failing of the media that this is not out there? It's not something that is being discussed. I mean, $3 billion should capture the imagination of the public, you would think, and it just seems
Right.
it hasn't.
It hasn't, Alex. And what's even more extraordinary is it's really not like this couple hides the money. I mean, they are blatantly ostentatious, putting photos on Instagram of all the wealth and the clothes and the parties and the planes. I mean, they're not hiding a thing. And I think what worries me a bit is that, in times like this, with an election on the doorstep, we tend to be myopic. We tend to look in and not out. And it's much easier, I mean, people care less about what's going on in places that they're not physically in. I mean, so, where, immigration feels so pressing. And so that's what everybody talks about, the economy. But this, right, it's too, right. But this is, um, I mean, what has kept America great for so long was that the systems of democracy were thought through. I mean, you can hear from my accent. I grew up in England, and it always strikes me how hard the founding fathers, thought to put the systems of government in place that we have. But bound up in all of that, it is just as important is our dealings with foreign countries, and it's just as important that we're not run by people who are for sale, open to the highest bidder. It's really dangerous when that happens, and it's really, that is global security at great, great risk. And I wish people paid more attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you laid out so well, what Kushner, potentially did do with the Gulf states was not in the interests of the United States.
No.
And I remember so well when Rex Tillerson, was pushed out and later spoke publicly, that he accused Kushner of running his own foreign policy behind his back. And, when Rex Tillerson kind of ends up being the voice of reason and the voice of, it was something really surprising, but he really wanted, to try to, have America's best interests at heart and
Yeah.
it's definitely a very concerning
Yeah.
topic, and it's hard to know kind of where it goes, especially if, Trump is successful in being reelected. It's just,
Well, I think it's I mean, people just don't talk about it, but what Jared has ultimately proven, in a sense, I hate to say this, he's won.
yeah,
Because, the theme of Kushner Inc. is that all along, for some, albeit tragic reasons in his life, he's thought that rules don't apply to him. And one could say Trump similarly thinks rules don't apply to him. But Jared, and the optics of what he's done since leaving the Trump White House, the money he's made from all the people he sucked up to while he was running America's foreign policy, and now it looks like he ought to be able to do it again. It sort of, I hate to say this, it shows that for Jared Kushner, at the very least, going into government is a very profitable enterprise. Well, that's not
how it's
what
supposed
this
to
country
be.
is supposed to be about.
Yeah, I saw you were pretty critical of a New York Times profile on
Yeah.
Kushner and affinity
Well,
partners.
yes, I was, because they paraphrased some of his quotes. And, I know Jared Kushner, and I know that his specific word choice often has meaning. And what that means is I suspect, is that he asked to go on background for a reason. And look, I just think that we need to apply the most rigorous journalistic standards possible to these people. There shouldn't be background. There shouldn't be, I mean, we're past the point where access is what we're seeking. We want accountability.
Absolutely, especially I think I kind of went back through there. One of the most kind of telling and really surprising parts about affinity partners at the beginning was Kushner was just sitting on the money. He wasn't really investing it. The people who had given the money weren't seeing any kind of return. He
Right.
was parking it anywhere.
Right.
And he was taking I think it was a $25 million a year
Right,
advisory fee to sit on
right,
the money. So he
right.
wasn't even
No,
doing the job of private equity with
no.
the money. It was,
Yeah, well, that's what led, as I think I'm right in saying, Ron Wyden's latest letter is like, how can anyone, be forgiven for thinking that this is the exact appearance of quid pro quo, that you get all this money invested and a management fee and you're not doing anything with it?
right. Yeah.
I
So
mean,
there isn't some
that's
plausible.
nonsensical.
Yeah. I mean, is there any way to entertain that there is some plausible explanation for?
No, no, and I'm plugged into. I mean, I've written books about business as well as books on politics and real estate, and no, I mean, there's nobody in the private equity world to whom that makes any sense whatsoever.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to me about this. I think,
Well, thank you for asking the questions.
well, you are truly the person to talk to about this, and I've always found it to be a very fascinating topic, and it's certainly going to have resonance in the future. It seems like so.
Yeah, let's hope people start to really pay attention and that these two don't get stuck in a silo, which is what I fear happened before, and that people sort of don't. You have to see the whole picture here, and that's why it's hard, because the way we divide our journalists and reporters for practical reasons is into beats, but they're siloed from each other. And so I would argue there need to be, at news organizations everywhere, meetings that bring everybody together, so that the people who are covering business and the people who are covering these foreign countries and states are all in the same room as the people who are covering a Trump White House, if there is one. And then there need to be people watching Jared and Ivanka like hawks.
And working hand in hand with like true investigators,
Yes,
journalists who are paid.
that's why you're going to need the people who are based, like you were, in Israel. You're going to need the people on the foreign desks, everybody.
Right.
You can't cover these people in silos.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, thank you again so much for joining me. For
Thank you.
fans of Vicky, her next book comes out next year with James Patterson. If you want to tell.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It's a real departure for me. It's a book about the horrific murders in Idaho of the 4 college students who were literally murdered in their beds. The suspect is a criminology PhD student who was arrested the other side of the country in Pennsylvania. And I've spent a lot of time now in Idaho and in this little town, Moscow. And it's a really, really tragic, but very important story for the time and place that we all live in right now.
Absolutely, definitely captured. I think it shocked the country. Definitely be a
Yeah.
book to look out for. Thanks again,
Thank
Vicky.
you.
Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Alex.